This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 591, entitled Masculist Annoyance with Manospherers who remain stuck in the psychology phase. Description. This flyer expresses the annoyance that masculists feel towards Manospherers who remain stuck in the initial psychology phase of men's lib development. It makes an analogy with the historical development of the feminist movement, which went through two major phases: the consciousness-raising phase, followed by the political phase, which got many gender laws passed that greatly improved the lives and rights of women. Masculists want to see more Manospherers move on into the second major phase of men's lib development by pushing for the men-fairing of the gender laws via the establishment of GECs, that's GECs, Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists. The male half of these GECs will then legislate the paternity rejection right, the OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births to combat paternity fraud by women, etc. The GEC masculist politicians will push for the biconsciousing of society so that men's lives are greatly improved and that relations between the sexes are greatly improved as well. Now the flyer itself. Masculist Annoyance with Manospherers who remain stuck in the psychology phase, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. I look daily at the content of the manosphere, mainly using the website MGTOW.tv, and notice in the large majority of cases that the video content providers are discussing psychological issues, talking about female psychology, often from an evolutionary psychological point of view, or about how women's behaviour and attitudes impact badly on men. As a politically minded masculist, I get annoyed by this concentration on the psychological side of men's lib. This is not to say that I disagree with this material. It is necessary and important, and millions of men, blue-pilled men, need to know about this stuff. So the material that appears on the manosphere needs to be there. What annoys me, though, is that these manosphere content providers are not providing, and that is that they are not moving into the major second stage, the second phase of men's lib, and that is the political phase. I need to explain, and that is probably best done by analogy with the history of the development of the feminist movement. The historical development of the feminist movement occurred in essentially two broad phases or stages. That is, the first consciousness-raising phase/stage and the second political phase/stage. In the first stage, women were coming together in consciousness-raising groups in the late 60s, after the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which complained about the ennui that upper middle-class women felt once their two kids were off to kindergarten or school. And these women, with their degrees, their household gadgets, and the pill, found that they had time on their hands and felt their lives were hollow, asking themselves in bed at night next to their careering husbands, quote, "Is this all?" Question mark. Also, many women active in the US civil rights movement in the 60s disliked the way women were treated by the men in that movement and rebelled, arguing that if blacks should be given equal rights with whites, then women should also be given equal rights with men. A lot of these women resented a male civil rights activist's wit's famous answer to the question, quote, What is the position of women in the civil rights movement? Answer, prone. So, in the late 60s, millions of women were talking amongst themselves in consciousness-raising groups about the traditional housewife role of women in Western society, expressing their desire to play a more substantial role than being just housewives and child raisers. They wanted careers and to be given equal rights with men. In these consciousness-raising groups, they were educating themselves about what women wanted for themselves, how they felt frustrated by the gender status quo, and how they felt society should be changed. By the 70s, there were enough professional feminists who had had their feminist consciousnesses raised to move on to the second major phase, that is, of political action, specifically in terms of changing the gender laws more in favour of women. So organisations in the US such as NOW, N-O-W, National Organisation for Women, then began to apply real political force to change the gender laws for women in women's favour. For example, equal pay for equal work, equal access to the professions, acquiring fault-free divorce, taking control of the divorce courts and converting them into family courts, legislating the abortion right in the US in 1973, legislating parental leave from work in 1993, etc. In other words, it was clear that the feminists had moved on from their first consciousness-raising phase into a very active and effective second political phase in which gender laws got changed that bettered the lives and rights of millions of women. Since I'm an old masculist, in brackets, 75 years old at the time of writing, that is 3/4 of a century old, close brackets, I was a young adult when the second wave of feminism got off the ground in the late 60s. I saw with my own experience how women transitioned away from the initial consciousness-raising stage to the second and much more powerful and influential political stage, which got gender laws changed that impacted on the quality of millions of women's lives, that opened up the possibility for female careerism that young women today take for granted. But it was their grandmothers who made this possible for them. Okay, that is the feminist analogy. Now, how does this feminist analogy impact on men's gender political development? For me, it's clear that the Masculists now have their own well-developed Masculist ideology, their own Masculist rhetoric, and their own ism. So the time is now ripe to start moving on into the second major phase of men's lib, that is the political phase, so that the politically minded Masculists can do for men in the current decade what politically minded feminists did for women in the 70s, that is, change gender laws in women's favour, for example, the substantial list given above. It's clear to me, looking at the content in the Manosphere, that there are now enough Manospherers, men's libbers, Masculists, that collectively we should start pushing for the political changes, that is, legislation of men-fair gender laws that will impact upon the lives of millions of men. In other words, the time is ripe, now that enough men have had their Masculist consciousnesses raised, for us to move on into the second major phase, similar to what the feminists did in the 70s. So what should these masculisted men, who have had their Masculist and MGTOW consciousnesses raised, be doing politically that will improve the lives of millions, later billions, of men? There's a lot to be done that I now list in reasonable detail, mapping out a Masculist political program, a Masculist political manifesto. The first major task of the Masculists is education, teaching society that gender oppression is not a one-way street, as the feminists preach. Feminism is a profoundly misandrist, gynocentric ideology that teaches women that gender oppression is a one-way street, that women are the oppressed and men are the oppressors. So women grow up with the idea that men should be hated for the ways that men oppress women. But due to feminism's deep gynocentrism, it teaches women nothing about how women oppress men. So masculists need to educate society how women oppress men, and in fact worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, making them a lot more serious than vice versa. For example, masculists claim that even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women, is small beer in comparison with any of the big three ways that women oppress men. That is, women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering. Anyone studying any of these big three will become conscious of what horrible gender crimes these are that women commit against men, and will learn a hatred towards such women for committing these horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes against men. Masculists need to spread their ideas to young men, teaching them that since the feminists have taken over the divorce courts, these feminists have made divorce toxic for men, and hence have made marriage and paternity toxic for men, which has caused 2/3 of young men in many Western countries to reject marriage and paternity, resulting in a crash in the birth rate. So these feminists who control the divorce courts have become indirect genociders who have to be stopped. Masculists need to apply tremendous moral pressure on young women to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, equals financially independent persons, by bothering to get career competent educations so that they can become FIPs as adults and not expect, fluffy style, to parasite off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades and later divorce raping him at the rate of one married father in 4, a horrendous gender crime against men. So the politically minded masculists who have moved into the second major stage of masculist gender political development want the establishment of GECs, GECs, gender equality committees, in the parliaments that consist half of female feminist politicians and half of male masculist politicians, so that the gender issues of both sexes are treated equally, which is far from being the case today. Most feminists today are strictly monoconscious, who have been powerfully brainwashed for the past 6 decades of feminist monopoly over gender politics that gender oppression is a one-way street. So they will be hotly opposed to the masculist push for the establishment of the GECs. So masculist politicians will have to push them back strongly, haranguing these monoconscious feminazi bigots with masculist ideas, telling these MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, that gender oppression is a two-way street, and that in reality women oppress men worse. For example, the big 3 ways of women's manslavery, divorce rape, forced fathering, and other major gender crimes that women commit against men. So for a few years, while the biconscious masculist politicians educate the monoconscious feminist politicians, there'll be a lot of verbal ideological blood spilt until the monoconscious feminist politicians are converted to biconscious feminists. Once these GECs are formed, the male half of masculist politicians will push for the legislation of the para, that's paternity rejection right, so that if a man rejects an unwanted pregnancy, he will be given the same right that a woman has today to do so. That is, women today have the MARA, maternity rejection right, but men don't have the para, paternity rejection right, which is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists. Millions of women force men into unwanted fatherhood through the lack of the para. This lack is a major gender crime against men that makes masculistic men hate those women who commit the massive gender crime against men of forced fathering, forcing a man to pay for a kid he doesn't want for decades of his life, a massive and hated gender crime by women against men. The masculist politicians will legislate laws that criminalise women who commit paternity fraud, that is, who lie to their man that the kid growing in her is his when she knows it's not, that it is the kid of some other man. Masculists see this crime of paternity fraud as worse and more serious than rape. So women who commit this crime should be given 15 years in prison, given that the typical sentence for a rapist is 10 years. The masculist politicians will also legislate the OPTAB, OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth, for all births to block paternity fraud. The male victim of paternity fraud can then use the para to reject paying for a kid that is not even his. And if he chooses, he can put his paternity fraudster woman in jail for 15 years. The masculist politicians will aim for the general biconsciousing of society, so that everyone gets the message that gender oppression is a two-way street, so that those people who remain monoconscious will be seen as bigots, as old-fashioned and callous towards the plight of men, who are the victims of the massive gender crimes that women commit against men. Once society is well informed of the fact that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, then relations between the sexes will be a lot healthier. Once monoconscious feminists have been converted to biconsciousness, they will lose their monoconscious feminazi bitchiness and become a lot more sympathetic towards men, and hence be a lot more approachable by men, and so will be more likely to have and to keep their boyfriends. Creating a biconscious society is a major goal of the Masculists that will require political action, that is, the men-fairing of the gender laws, which will require that large numbers of men in